What if Christianity never became Roman? What if it was never adopted by an empire, never legalized, never institutionalized? What if it had remained what it was in the beginning? A Jewish movement inside Israel's story. No basilicas, no imperial councils, no Sunday laws. Just a Messiah proclaimed in Jerusalem. Torah, feasts, synagogue life. At what point did the faith of Yeshua stop looking Jewish and start looking Roman? In this video, we're going back before Constantine, before Nicaea, before Rome, to ask a question almost no one asks. If Rome had never touched it, what would Christianity look like today? My name is the Prophet 33, and I bring you the Word of God. The reason I wear a mask is because I am persecuted in my country for my faith. This mask protects my life. Let's continue. What if Christianity had never been adopted by an empire? Not persecuted, not legalized, not institutionalized. What if it had remained what it was at the beginning? A Jewish movement inside the world of the synagogue, centered in Jerusalem, shaped by Torah, prayer, and the hope of Israel. We are so used to Christianity as a global religion, with cathedrals, councils, and creeds, that we rarely stop and ask a simpler question. At what point did the faith of Jesus, or better yet, Yeshua, stop looking Jewish and start looking Roman? Because in the beginning, it did not speak Latin, it did not build basilicas, it did not organize itself like an imperial administration. It gathered in homes, it prayed in synagogues, it went up to Jerusalem for the feasts. The first followers of Yeshua did not believe they were creating a new religion. They believed the God of Israel had fulfilled his promises. For nearly 3 centuries, this movement survived without state power, without imperial protection, without enforced uniformity, and then something changed. When Constantine embraced the faith, it was no longer only a persecuted minority, it became entangled with empire. And history teaches us something very consistent. When a faith enters an empire, the empire does not stay neutral. It shapes language, authority, identity, and even memory. So here's the thought experiment that will guide this entire discussion. If Rome had never touched it, if Christianity had never become imperial, would it still look the way it does today? Or would it have remained far closer to its Jewish roots? To answer that honestly, we have to rewind, not to Rome, not to councils, but back to Jerusalem, back to the world in which Yeshua actually lived. At some point, the movement around Jesus became something the world now calls Christianity. But when exactly did that shift happen? The first time the word appears in the New Testament is in Acts 11:26, where we are told that the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. Notice the wording carefully. It does not say they called themselves Christians. It says they were called that. By whom? Most likely by outsiders. Antioch was not Jerusalem. It was a large, mixed Hellenistic city where Jews and Gentiles interacted daily, and labels were often given by the surrounding culture. The term Christian simply meant belonging to the Messiah, or followers of the Anointed One. But at that stage, it did not yet mean a separate religion detached from Israel. The disciples in Antioch were still reading the Hebrew Scriptures. They were still proclaiming the God of Israel. They were still rooted in the story of Abraham, Moses, and the prophets. Even Paul, decades later, standing before Roman authorities, does not say, "I have left Judaism." In Acts 24:14, he says, "I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets." That is not the language of a man founding a new religion. That is the language of a Jew who believes something has happened inside the story of Israel. So the question becomes sharper. If the earliest believers in Yeshua did not see themselves as abandoning Judaism, when did the label Christian begin to mean something detached from Jewish identity? Was it in Antioch? Was it after the destruction of Jerusalem? Or was it later when the faith began to move further and further into the Gentile world and eventually into the hands of Rome? The name appeared early, but the separation did not happen overnight. It was gradual, cultural, political, and theological. And once Rome entered the picture, the meaning of that name began to shift in ways the first generation of believers may not have recognized at all. Before there was a church, before there were councils, before Christianity was even a category, there was a Jewish teacher walking the hills of Judea. Yeshua was not operating outside Judaism. He was operating inside it. He taught in synagogues. He read from the scroll of Isaiah. He debated Pharisees using the language of Torah. And he went up to Jerusalem for the feasts. In Luke 4, we see him reading from the prophet Isaiah in a synagogue. In John 7, he goes up to Jerusalem for Sukkot. In Matthew 5, he says clearly, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." Everything about his life is embedded in the world of Second Temple Judaism. The categories he used were Jewish categories: Messiah, kingdom, Torah, Israel, covenant. Even his disputes were internal Jewish debates, not attacks from outside the system. When he speaks about resurrection, purity, Sabbath, or authority, he is participating in conversations that already existed within Judaism. Nothing about his ministry suggests the founding of a new religion detached from Israel. In fact, he tells his disciples in Matthew 10 to go nowhere among the Gentiles, but rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. That is not the launch of a global Gentile institution. It is a mission rooted in covenant identity. If we strip away centuries of later theology and simply place Yeshua back into his historical context, what we see is not Christianity as we know it, but a Jewish renewal movement centered on the belief that the promises to Israel were reaching their fulfillment. And that context matters, because once we understand where it began, we can begin to measure how far it later moved. If the movement of Yeshua was truly becoming a new religion, we would expect to see an immediate break from Jewish life in Jerusalem, but that is not what the text shows us. In Acts 2, on the festival of Shavuot, not a new invented holiday, but one of the appointed feasts of Israel, thousands of Jews gather in Jerusalem as they did every year. It is there in that Jewish setting that the message about the risen Messiah is proclaimed. And what happens? About 3,000 people are added in a single day. 3,000 Jews. Not converts to a new religion, but Jews who now believe that Yeshua was the promised Messiah. And what do they do next? Acts 2:46 tells us they continued daily in the temple, not hiding from it, not rejecting it, not abandoning it. They were still part of Jerusalem's religious life. Later, in Acts 21:20, decades after the resurrection, James tells Paul something that many modern readers overlook. You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law. That statement alone challenges the common narrative. Thousands of Jewish believers. Zealous for the Torah, still fully embedded in Jewish identity. This does not look like a church separated from Israel. It looks like a Jewish movement within Israel. And this continued for years. The leadership was in Jerusalem. The debates were internal. The scriptures they read were the Hebrew scriptures. So when we imagine early Christianity, we must be careful not to project later European forms backward onto the first century. What we actually see in Jerusalem is not the birth of a detached religion, but the expansion of a messianic conviction within Judaism itself. And that raises a powerful question. If this is how it looked in Jerusalem, what forces were strong enough to gradually reshape it into something else? Acts 21 is one of the most revealing and uncomfortable passages for modern assumptions about early Christianity. When Paul arrives in Jerusalem, he meets James and the elders, and they tell him something astonishing. You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law. Not confused about the law, not liberated from the law, zealous for it. This is decades after the resurrection of Yeshua, decades after the message had spread beyond Judea. And yet in Jerusalem, the epicenter of the movement, thousands of Jewish believers are described as Torah zealous. That phrase would not have been casual. In first century language, to be zealous for the law meant deep commitment to covenant faithfulness. It meant loyalty to the God of Israel expressed through obedience. And what is striking is that James does not correct them. He does not say they misunderstood grace. Instead, the concern raised in the passage is whether Paul himself is being falsely accused of teaching Jews to abandon Moses. To resolve the tension, Paul participates in temple rites to demonstrate that he himself lives in observance of the law. This is not the picture of a religion that is already broken from Judaism. It is the picture of an internal Jewish debate about how Gentiles fit into Israel's story. If early belief in Yeshua automatically meant departure from Torah and Jewish identity, Acts 21 makes very little sense. But if the movement was still operating within Jewish categories, the passage becomes entirely coherent, and that forces us to slow down. Because if, for decades, thousands of Jewish believers remained Torah observant in Jerusalem, then the eventual separation between Judaism and Christianity was not immediate. It was gradual. It was shaped by pressures, politics, and history. And that brings us to a turning point, not theological at first, but imperial. For nearly 3 centuries, the followers of Jesus, or Yeshua, lived without political power. They were sometimes ignored, sometimes misunderstood, and at times brutally persecuted. They had no emperor defending them, no legal privilege, no imperial endorsement. Their authority came from scripture, from community leadership, and from shared conviction. But in the early 4th century, something happened that would permanently alter the trajectory of the movement. In 313 AD, the Edict of Milan granted legal status to Christianity within the Roman Empire. And behind that shift stood one man, Constantine the Great. When Constantine embraced the faith, Christianity moved from the margins of society to the center of imperial attention. What had once been a persecuted minority was now favored by the most powerful political system in the known world. And that transition cannot be treated as neutral. When a faith becomes legal under an empire, it gains protection. but it also gains expectations. Structures begin to formalize. Leadership begins to centralize. Doctrinal disagreements that were once debated within communities now require standardization across provinces. Over time, Christianity was no longer simply a network of assemblies rooted in the story of Israel. It became intertwined with imperial administration. Bishops gained influence not only spiritually but politically. Unity was no longer just theological. It became a matter of state stability. And once the faith entered that space, it began to adapt to survive and function within it. The question is not whether this helped Christianity expand. Clearly it did. The question is what it cost in the process. Because when the message of a Jewish Messiah becomes aligned with Roman imperial power, something profound has shifted in both tone and identity. And that shift did not stop with legalization. It moved into doctrine, calendar, authority, and memory itself. When we speak about the turning point between a persecuted movement and an imperial religion, we cannot avoid the figure of Constantine the Great. Constantine was not a bishop, not a rabbi, not a theologian. He was a Roman emperor, a military strategist, a political ruler. According to historical accounts, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, he claimed to have seen a vision connected to the sign of Christ. Whether one views that event as genuine faith, political calculation, or a mixture of both, the outcome was undeniable. The Emperor of Rome aligned himself with Christianity. That alignment changed everything. Until that moment, the movement of Jesus had grown through persuasion, endurance, and martyrdom. After Constantine, it began to grow through imperial support. Churches were funded. Clergy were elevated in social status. Disputes that once remained local now required imperial attention because theological division threatened political unity. Constantine was deeply concerned with stability. An empire fractured by religious conflict was an unstable empire. And so the faith of Yeshua was no longer only about covenant promises and scripture. It became entangled with imperial cohesion. When an emperor adopts a faith, he does not enter it as an ordinary believer. He brings the weight of the throne with him. And with that weight comes influence. Influence over language, influence over structure, influence over which theological voices are amplified and which are marginalized. The shift was subtle at first, but profound over time. The question is not whether Constantine intended to reshape Christianity. The question is whether Christianity could remain unchanged once embraced by the most powerful ruler on earth. Because from that moment forward, the story of the faith was no longer unfolding only in synagogues and homes. It was unfolding in palaces and council chambers. In 325 AD, less than 2 decades after legalizing Christianity, Constantine convened a gathering that would mark a decisive shift in the history of the faith, the First Council of Nicaea. This was not merely a theological meeting. It was an imperial council. Bishops from across the empire were summoned to resolve disputes, most famously the controversies surrounding the nature of Christ. Now, theological debate had always existed within the movement of Yeshua. Disagreements were not new. But what was new was this: an emperor calling the meeting, presiding over the atmosphere, and expecting unity for the sake of imperial stability. The goal was not only doctrinal clarity, it was cohesion. An empire divided religiously was politically fragile. And so the faith that once navigated disagreements through letters, dialogue, and local leadership now entered a new phase where theological decisions were formalized at empire-wide gatherings. Creeds were drafted. Language was standardized. Boundaries were defined. None of this happened in a vacuum. It happened in the shadow of imperial power. And once doctrine becomes tied to state-backed authority, it carries a different weight. It is no longer simply what a community believes, it becomes what the empire affirms. Over time, this process shaped not only theology, but also identity. The question we must ask carefully is this: would the faith of Jesus, rooted in the world of Second Temple Judaism, have developed the same structures and formulations without the pressure and sponsorship of Rome? Or did the empire accelerate certain developments while silencing others? The Council at Nicaea did not invent Christianity, but it did mark a moment when the faith became something administered, codified, and protected at an imperial level. And once that shift occurred, the trajectory was permanently altered. I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has already become a channel member through YouTube memberships. Your support truly helps me continue creating this content and building a spiritually meaningful community. If you feel connected and would like to support the vision, you can join by clicking the link in the description. It's simple, secure, and handled directly by YouTube. Thank you for being part of this journey. Before Christianity became intertwined with empire, its structure resembled something far more familiar within Jewish life: the synagogue model. Leadership was local. Authority was relational. Communities gathered around scripture, prayer, teaching, and shared meals. Elders were recognized from within the community, not appointed through imperial channels. The assemblies described in Acts and in the letters of Paul were not state-administered institutions. They were networks of believers bound by covenant language and shared trust. But as the faith moved deeper into the Roman world, and especially after imperial endorsement, its structure began to mirror the empire that housed it. Bishops were no longer merely local shepherds. Some became regional authorities. Major cities gained elevated status. Rome itself eventually became a center of gravitational authority. Hierarchy solidified. Layers of leadership became more formalized. This development was not necessarily malicious. It was, in many ways, practical. An expanding faith across vast territories required organization. But organization within an empire often takes the shape of that empire. Rome was hierarchical. It was centralized. It valued order, rank, and administrative clarity, and over time, the faith reflected those patterns. The model gradually shifted from synagogue-style assemblies rooted in Jewish communal life to a more imperial structure that resembled Roman governance. Authority became more institutional than relational. Uniformity became more emphasized than local diversity. And once structure changes, theology often follows, because how a community is organized influences how it understands power, interpretation, and even access to God. The question is not whether structure was needed. The question is whether the structure that emerged was shaped more by Jerusalem or by Rome. One of the clearest ways to trace identity is through the calendar a community keeps. Time reveals loyalty. In the world of Yeshua, the rhythm of life was structured around Shabbat and the appointed feasts of Israel. The Sabbath was not merely a day of rest, it was covenantal identity. It marked Israel as distinct among the nations. The earliest followers of Jesus were Jews who already lived within that rhythm. The book of Acts repeatedly shows Paul entering synagogues on the Sabbath. Nowhere in the New Testament do we see a command abolishing Shabbat or replacing it with another day. Yet by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a gradual shift was underway. Sunday, the first day of the week, began to take on increasing significance because of the resurrection. That development in itself is understandable. But when the faith moved into the Roman sphere, something further happened. In 321 AD, Constantine issued a civil decree declaring Sunday a day of rest throughout the empire. Notice the difference. What had once been a theological remembrance of resurrection became a legally enforced day under imperial law. The Roman week already honored the sun on that day. The alignment was convenient. Over time, the shift from Sabbath to Sunday was no longer just devotional, it became cultural and political. And once an empire legislates sacred time, it reinforces identity through power. The question is not whether honoring the resurrection is meaningful. The question is whether the move from Shabbat, rooted in covenant with Israel, to an imperial Sunday reshaped how believers understood their connection to that covenant. Because calendars are never neutral. They signal belonging. And when sacred time shifts, identity often shifts with it. If Sabbath marks weekly identity, Passover marks historical identity. Pesach is not simply a festival. It is the foundational story of redemption in the Hebrew Scriptures. It anchors Israel's memory in the Exodus, in deliverance, in covenant faithfulness. Yeshua's final meal with his disciples was a Passover meal. The language of the New Testament is saturated with that imagery. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 5:7, "For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." That is not accidental language. It places the death of Jesus directly inside the Passover narrative. For the earliest believers, the resurrection did not replace Pesach. It fulfilled it within Israel's calendar. Yet by the 2nd century, controversy emerged over when the resurrection should be celebrated. Some communities insisted on keeping it in connection with the Jewish Passover date. Others argued for a Sunday-based calculation independent of the Jewish calendar. When imperial authority later entered the scene, that tension was resolved decisively. After the Council of Nicaea, the celebration of what became known as Easter was formally separated from the Jewish reckoning of Passover. The reasoning was not only theological, it was also political and cultural. Distancing the faith from Jewish calculation reinforced a distinct identity within the empire. Over time, the connection between the crucifixion and the Exodus framework faded in the popular imagination. The festival remained about resurrection, but the covenantal context of Israel's story was weakened. This is not a minor adjustment in scheduling. It is a shift in narrative anchoring. When the remembrance of Yeshua's death and resurrection moves from the calendar of Israel into an independently calculated festival shaped within a Greco-Roman world, the story is still told, but it is told in a different frame. And frames matter because they determine how people understand continuity with the God of Israel. In the beginning, everything pointed to Jerusalem. The temple stood there. The apostles gathered there. James led from there. Pilgrimage festivals drew believers there. Acts 1-7 unfold entirely within the orbit of the holy city. Even Paul, the apostle to the nations, repeatedly returns to Jerusalem, eager to be there for the feasts. The gravitational center of the movement of Yeshua was not abstract. It was geographical. It was tied to the city where the covenant story had unfolded for centuries. But history intervened. In 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome. The temple was burned. The city was devastated. That catastrophe fractured Jewish life and inevitably reshaped the Yeshua movement as well. As decades passed and the faith spread throughout the empire, new centers of influence emerged. Antioch, Alexandria, and eventually Rome itself. Rome was not just another city. It was the capital of the empire. It represented power, administration, order. Over time, the Bishop of Rome gained increasing prominence. Gradually, the symbolic center of Christianity shifted westward. What had once been a Jerusalem-rooted movement became increasingly Roman-centered in structure and authority. The physical relocation of influence carried theological implications. When the center moves, interpretation often moves with it. The scriptures of Israel remained, but they were now read within a different cultural imagination. The story of covenant land, temple, and Israel was increasingly interpreted through categories shaped by a Gentile imperial world. This does not mean faith in Yeshua disappeared or was corrupted overnight. It means the environment surrounding it changed dramatically, and environments shape identity over time. The question we must carefully consider is this: when the spiritual center of gravity moves from Jerusalem to Rome, does the faith retain the same sense of continuity with Israel, or does it begin to redefine itself in ways the first generation would not have anticipated? Separation rarely happens overnight. It happens slowly, through language, through habits, through subtle shifts in emphasis. In the first century, believing in Yeshua did not require abandoning Jewish identity. As we saw in Acts 21, thousands of Jewish believers were still zealous for the Torah. But as the faith moved further into the Gentile world and increasingly distanced itself from Jewish communal life, a new dynamic emerged. Jewish revolts against Rome in 66-70 AD, and again in 132-135 AD, intensified suspicion toward anything perceived as Jewish. In an empire that had crushed Judea, alignment with Jewish identity carried political risk. For Gentile believers seeking stability, differentiation became easier than solidarity. Over time, theological language began to reflect that distance. Instead of seeing themselves as grafted into Israel's story, some began to speak as if Israel's role had diminished. The Hebrew scriptures were still read, but increasingly interpreted apart from living Jewish context. The term Old Testament itself subtly implied obsolescence in the popular imagination, even if theologians argued otherwise. None of this was necessarily driven by malice at first. It was shaped by cultural separation, geographic distance, and political pressure. But once Jewish identity was no longer central to Christian self-understanding, reinterpretation accelerated. The faith that began as a Messianic movement within Israel gradually became a predominantly Gentile religion, speaking about Israel from the outside. And when identity shifts, interpretation follows. The question is not whether Gentiles were meant to be included. The New Testament clearly affirms that they were. The question is whether inclusion slowly turned into displacement, because once the living connection to Jewish identity weakened, the story of Yeshua risked being detached from the covenant narrative that gave it meaning in the first place. In the earliest chapters of the story, Israel is not a side note. Israel is the stage. The promises to Abraham, the covenant at Sinai, the kingdom of David, the prophets speaking of restoration, all of it forms the framework within which Yeshua appears. Even Paul, writing to predominantly Gentile communities, anchors everything in Israel's story. In Romans 11, he warns Gentile believers explicitly not to become arrogant toward the natural branches. Remember, he says, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. That metaphor is not decorative. It defines identity. The root is Israel. The covenants belong to Israel. The promises belong to Israel. And Gentiles are grafted in. But as centuries passed and the church became increasingly Gentile in composition and Roman in structure, that rooted imagery began to fade in practice. Israel slowly moved from being the living root to being treated as the rejected past. The destruction of Jerusalem, the scattering of the Jewish people, and the rise of a powerful imperial church reinforced a perception that history itself had shifted favor. The narrative subtly transformed from God is fulfilling his promises to Israel and including the nations, to God has replaced Israel with the church. That transition was not declared in one single moment. It emerged through preaching, commentary, polemics, and eventually formal theology. And once Israel was perceived as spiritually sidelined, the Jewish context of Yeshua became less central to Christian identity. The faith remained centered on Christ, but the covenantal storyline that gave him context became secondary. This is not a small adjustment. When Israel becomes marginal in the imagination of the church, the entire framework of promise and fulfillment is reinterpreted. The question we must ask carefully is this: was that shift inevitable, or was it amplified by the imperial environment in which Christianity found itself? Once Israel began to move from the center of the Christian imagination to the margins, a new theological pattern slowly emerged. It did not appear fully formed overnight. It developed gradually through interpretation, through distance, through polemics. As the church became overwhelmingly Gentile and increasingly aligned with imperial structures, it became easier to speak of itself not as grafted into Israel, but as standing in Israel's place. The promises once understood as belonging to the covenant people began to be read primarily as spiritual metaphors applied to the church. The land became symbolic. The restoration prophecies became internalized. The covenant language was recentered around a new institutional identity. This is what later generations would call replacement theology, though the early stages were more subtle than formal doctrine. It was not always expressed as hostility. Often it was framed as fulfillment, but fulfillment quietly shifted into displacement. The church was no longer seen merely as participants in Israel's story. It was increasingly described as the true Israel, rendering the Jewish people theologically peripheral. Yet when we return to the New Testament, the tension remains unresolved in a very different way. Paul, writing in Romans 11, speaks of Israel's partial hardening as temporary, not final. He speaks of mystery, not cancellation. He speaks of irrevocable gifts and calling. That language does not support erasure. It preserves continuity. The deeper question we must ask is whether the rise of imperial Christianity accelerated a theological instinct to define itself over against Judaism, rather than alongside it. In an empire that had crushed Jewish revolts, distance from Jewish identity was politically convenient. Over time, theological distance followed cultural distance. And once that framework settled into tradition, and it became difficult to see how deeply it had shaped Christian self-understanding. The question is not whether the church has a role in God's redemptive plan. The question is whether that role was ever meant to replace Israel, or to remain rooted within Israel's unfolding covenant story. After tracing the arc from Jerusalem to Rome, from synagogue gatherings to imperial councils, we return to the original question with new clarity. What if Rome had never endorsed the faith of Jesus? What if Constantine had never aligned the empire with the movement of Yeshua? What if Christianity had remained a minority network of communities without state power, without imperial funding, without political incentive to distance itself from Jewish identity? Would its calendar look the same? Would its structure resemble imperial hierarchy? Would its theological language have shifted in the same way? It is possible that many core convictions would have remained intact. The belief in the resurrection, the proclamation that Yeshua is Messiah and Lord, the inclusion of the nations. But without imperial pressure for uniformity and distinction, would the separation from Jewish communal life have accelerated so dramatically? Without the political need to differentiate from a people Rome viewed as rebellious, would theological distance have hardened into replacement thinking? Without Sunday legislation, would Shabbat have remained more central in certain communities? Without council-backed standardization, would diversity within early interpretation have lasted longer? These are not accusations. They are historical questions, because the early movement survived for centuries without empire, and it did so while still visibly connected to Israel's story. The moment empire entered the equation, acceleration began. Structure solidified, identities sharpened, boundaries hardened. And so the thought experiment is not an imaginary fantasy. It is an attempt to isolate variables. If Rome had never touched it, would Christianity still carry the same imprint of imperial structure, calendar, and distance from Jewish roots? Or would it feel closer to the world in which Yeshua first walked? If Rome had never endorsed it, would the faith of Jesus, of Yeshua, have remained recognizably Jewish? Not ethnically exclusive, not closed to the nations, but structurally and rhythmically rooted in Israel's covenant life? The earliest evidence suggests it might have. The first generation of believers continued in the temple. They observed the appointed times. They framed everything within the promises to Abraham and David. Even as Gentiles were welcomed, they were described in Romans 11 not as founders of a new tree, but as branches grafted into an existing one. That metaphor assumes continuity, not replacement. Without imperial recentering toward Rome, perhaps Jerusalem would have retained greater symbolic gravity. Without the political tension between empire and Jewish revolt, perhaps differentiation would not have seemed necessary for survival. Without the need to define Christianity as distinct from Judaism in order to gain stability within a Gentile empire, perhaps the language of identity would have evolved differently. Of course, history is complex. The destruction of the temple in 70 AD already reshaped Jewish life profoundly. The Bar Kokhba revolt further intensified division. Even without Constantine, the faith was spreading into predominantly Gentile regions. So the question is not whether change was inevitable. Change always happens. The question is whether the scale and speed of separation were amplified once imperial endorsement entered the picture. Would communities of Yeshua followers have continued to mark Shabbat more consistently? Would Passover have remained the primary framework for understanding the crucifixion and resurrection? Would Israel have remained central in Christian imagination rather than peripheral? We cannot rewrite history, but we can observe trajectories. And the trajectory before empire looks noticeably different from the trajectory after it. That contrast invites reflection, not nostalgia, but clarity. If Rome had never endorsed the faith, would the rhythm of Christian life have shifted as dramatically as it did? Calendars and structures are not secondary details. They shape imagination. They train memory. They tell communities who they are. In the first century, the life of the Yeshua movement moved within the cadence of Israel's sacred time: Shabbat, Pesach, Shavuot, the fall festivals. Even Gentile believers learned the story of the Messiah within that framework. But once the faith became imperial, sacred time increasingly aligned with Roman civil time. Sunday became not only a theological symbol of resurrection, but a legally reinforced rhythm. Easter detached from the Jewish calculation of Passover. The connection to Israel's calendar weakened generation by generation. Structure followed a similar pattern. The synagogue-like assembly model gradually gave way to hierarchical organization shaped by imperial governance. Regional authority consolidated. Doctrinal boundaries hardened. Uniformity became a priority for cohesion. If Christianity had remained a minority network without state sponsorship, perhaps these developments would have unfolded more slowly or differently. Perhaps local diversity would have endured longer. Perhaps connection to Jewish communal rhythms would have remained more visible. We cannot prove the alternative history. But we can observe this. Empire accelerates standardization. Empire rewards clarity of boundary. Empire prefers centralized authority. When those forces meet a growing faith, transformation is almost inevitable. The deeper issue is not whether growth required organization. It is whether the form of organization that emerged reflected Jerusalem's communal roots or Rome's administrative instincts. That distinction matters, because structure and time shape theology more profoundly than we often realize. Before emperors, before councils, before creeds were drafted under imperial shadow, what did the faith actually look like? It looked like Jews in Jerusalem proclaiming that the Messiah had come. It looked like communities gathering around the Hebrew scriptures, reading Moses and the prophets as living testimony. It looked like prayer in synagogues, debate within Jewish categories, hope anchored in the restoration of Israel. It looked like Gentiles being welcomed into that story, not as founders of something new, but as participants in promises already given. It looked less institutional and more relational, less imperial and more communal, less detached from Israel and more rooted within her covenant narrative. This is not romantic nostalgia. The early movement had tensions, disagreements, and persecution, but its framework was unmistakably Jewish in language, rhythm, and expectation. When we strip away centuries of later development and simply read the New Testament on its own terms, the world we encounter is not Rome. It is Jerusalem. It is temple courts. It is feasts. It is Torah discussion. It is Messiah hope within Israel's story. And once we see that clearly, the contrast with later imperial forms becomes impossible to ignore. The question is not whether Christianity as it exists today carries truth. The question is whether we have fully reckoned with how different its earliest expression actually was. If the faith of Jesus, of Yeshua, began inside the covenant story of Israel, and if its earliest form looked unmistakably Jewish in rhythm, language, and expectation, then the real issue is not whether history can be undone. It cannot. The question is whether we are willing to look honestly at the layers that formed over time. Rome shaped structure. Rome shaped calendar. Rome shaped authority. That does not automatically invalidate everything that followed. But it does mean that what feels normal to modern Christianity may not be identical to what existed at the beginning. The first followers of Yeshua did not see themselves as founders of a new civilization. They believed the God of Israel had acted within his promises. And perhaps the most important question is this. When we read the New Testament today, are we reading it through Jerusalem or through Rome? Are we hearing it inside Israel's covenant framework or through categories shaped centuries later? This is not about rejecting history. It is about understanding it. Because once we see how empire influenced development, we are free to ask deeper questions about identity, continuity, and roots. And maybe the goal is not to recreate the first century, but to remember it clearly. To recognize that before there was an imperial Christianity, there was a Jewish Messiah movement, proclaiming that the God of Abraham had kept his word. And that memory changes how we understand everything that came after. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching and being part of this journey with me. Now I invite you to check out this recommended video right here. And if you're hungry for more eye-opening content, hit the subscribe button, and let's keep learning together.